Into the Cypher. Prepare for another all-nighter.
On the Talk of Chicago, 1690 WVON.
Well, Bears, like we said, with an unconventional win, at least for the last regime, the first game of the Mark Trestman era, and we see it kind of started the way an offensive game would have started the last few years here in town, but the offense picked up the pace, and the offense wound up being, I think, the reason why they won the game today.
I think it was balanced. I think when the first half of that game, offense and defense looked a little shaky. Now, I think what we were looking for offensively was the O-line, which we know has been totally retooled, only with Garza being the only piece that's left from last year. You got a right side, with Mills and Longs. They're very young. So the question was this O-line going to be able to give Jay Cutler the protection in time that he needed? And yes, they did, because he was upright the entire game. That within itself is a major accomplishment for a line that is really new working together. So I think at least offensively, that was the first thing that people were looking at. And let's say this about Trestman. When he noticed that the offensive line was struggling a bit, the flexibility in his game calling is fabulous, because he put a shotgun in. Nowhere would you have seen that in the last couple of years, that the O-line struggling, let's just try the shotgun to kind of help them out and giving protection to the quarterback. I like that flexibility. It makes so much more sense. So they did a lot of good things. No sacks, used the shotgun. The only thing I think they didn't do very well, but time will tell, and as the season rolls along, maybe those will get better, is they didn't necessarily create the kind of gaps you wouldn't want Forte to have for running up the middle of the field.
Yeah, a lot of the running was out of that shotgun, and it was successful early in the game, but then it kind of got repetitive, and Cincinnati caught on to it.
And
they were running out of that formation.
They switched it up. So, right. That's the only thing. There wasn't enough A or B gap openings to give Forte that, but at the same time, Forte is not a running back that does well in the middle of the field anyways, truth be told. So it isn't like one of his strengths. So that was the only thing I think they need to work on. But overall, you have to be impressed with what you saw with the O-line. Even offensively, Trestman did exactly what you would expect from him to do. You had 5 different receivers touching that ball. Marcellus Bennett, tight end. Oh, look, a tight end's back in the Chicago offense, and it looks great. Excellent touchdown. He was like, the ball is mine. It's not going anywhere. For once, Brandon Marshall wasn't overused in the offensive scheme. They got Earl Bennett involved. I wish he would have been involved more. It's just every component, they managed to stretch the field in the way they needed to. The first half wasn't reflective of that, because when you looked at the first half stats, they looked absolutely ridiculous. You're like, wow, if this is going to be how the whole game is going to go, this is not going to go well. You're talking about for total yards in the first half, they had 70 to Cincinnati's 245. So offensively, not only were they not clicking, defensively, they weren't stomping anything either. And that was a little dangerous. And I know that you thought I was being a little hard, you and some other people on Peanut Tillman, but let me just say this. One thing you should know, and this will never change for the entire season, and it's always been the case with him, he's not good in man coverage. Now, I granted you were trying to give him credit and say it's A.J. Green who's going to cover him. Okay, the one touchdown he got off of actual Tim Jennings was not Jennings' fault, because it wasn't his assignment, it was Major Wright's. And so when you saw Tim Jennings, I was like, Jennings is way off of Green more than I thought. It wasn't even his assignment to be there. So overall, why I said that you needed to give Mel Tucker a pass, at least on the first half, and give him props for the game, is because the first half was god-awful. The second half was fabulous on both sides of the ball, because what he had to do was this. He couldn't do a ton of blitz packages, at least in the first half, until they figured out how they couldn't stop A.J. Green, but how could they contain him? So he had to at least make sure that his corner and his safety could contain him. Then in the second half, you saw more blitz packages, you saw more pressure on the quarterback. He made the adjustments, and in the second half, total yards, they only gave up 75. So if you're telling me that wasn't a good adjustment, the defense is not what we're used to always seeing, but the adjustments were exactly on point where they needed to be.
I think a lot of A.J. Green could have had a much bigger game than he had. The one interception was from behind him, and it went off of his hands and then deflected into Tillman's hands. That was a ball that A.J. Green should have caught, that ball. So A.J. Green, it wasn't a thing where A.J. Green could have did a whole lot better, but my point is he's going to have big numbers against everybody. It's not a thing.
I agree.
But I can't give Mel Tucker props, is what I'm saying, because the defense didn't do anything outstanding today. They had 1 sack, and that was late in the game.
Okay, but the bottom line is this:
they didn't do anything where they stood out like, wow, this is a great play. Tillman, the 2 plays, as you mentioned, he was in the right place at the right time. More of a vulture than anything else.
I told you, gang tackle mentality.
But it wasn't a thing where the defense was like, wow. There was no wow
Here's the thing.
moments on defense
I think
today.
what you're confusing is every play on defense is not going to be a wow moment. It's about finding consistency and stopping the bleeding, and that's exactly what they did in the second half.
They were doing a lot of bending today.
Like I said,
a lot of bending.
They went from giving up 245 total yards in the first half to 75 in the second.
How much of that though was the Bears controlling the ball more?
No,
in the second half?
here's the thing though.
That was a lot. That had a lot to do with it.
But here's the thing. It's about balance. I think what you're not wanting to accept is there's finally balance on both sides of the ball. No longer is the defense being asked to be on the field for long periods of time and being exhausted. The offense is actually scoring.
But what I'm saying is you can't chalk the 75 yards up they gave up in the second half up to the defense is what I'm saying. A lot of that is more to do with the ball control of the Bears offense.
At the same time, you can't say that they could have gone out there and kept giving up stuff. So if you're trying to tell me the difference between only giving up 75 opposed to 245, if you think that's not proper adjustments, not to mention you saw more pressure on the quarterback in the second half with Andy Dalton, simply because, and this was smart, don't make too many adjustments up front, especially if you haven't contained what you know is going to be your scoring threat in A.J. Green. And rather the ball bounces off his hands. The bottom line is, not only did they manage to figure out a way to at least manage him to a degree, I'm not saying stop him, but manage him. They also figured out, okay, now we can do more blitz packages because we figured out what we need to do. And I think the adjustments that he made in the second half, by no means, like I said to you in the production meeting, I'd rather have an ugly win than a pretty loss. And that's the bottom line. And that's what this was today. This was an ugly win. All White Sox.
I don't go ugly. That wasn't.
It was ugly. I mean, here's the thing too. One thing that they were consistent with, the Bears in this game, is that they didn't lack mental discipline and get a lot of penalties. They didn't make too many mistakes. Even though they were behind the 8-ball and went into halftime not leading and maybe were a little, like, man, this is not going the way we thought. They didn't come back out and lose their focus. One of Cincinnati's biggest issues, and I don't think Lewis will ever be able to fix this, is they lack mental discipline, not just off the field, but on the field.
They're AFC Detroit Lions.
Exactly. They're like the Detroit Lions. They lack mental focus. And that, to me, partially hurt their performance. I mean, so at the end of the day, I'm not saying that Mel Tucker just blew it out the water, but I like the fact that he was able to make the compensations in the second half. And when they had to have the defensive stops, here's what's important. They did it.
I can't call it ugly, though, because they, like I said in the starters, they did things that last year's teams weren't doing, or the last regime's teams weren't doing. They had long, sustained offensive drives. Like, name any of those times those things happened last year.
We can agree. We can agree on that. I agree 100%.
That's why I can't call the win ugly, in the traditional terms of an ugly win, where the Bears would get a bunch of turnovers and fall ass backwards into touchdowns and all that stuff. Those were ugly Bears wins. This doesn't qualify as that.
I mean,